Welcome to Conversations from the Edge of Consciousness. I'm your host, Christine Madera. For me, and possibly for you, the inner world of consciousness has always been much more real and way more fun than the so-called real material world. Growing up, I thought I was alone in this, but I'm not. There are a lot of us, and far too many have no one to talk to who shares this experience. I've been lucky to cultivate a community of friends who love to talk about the energies, ideas, and vibrations that are pushing the edges of our own consciousness, as well as our collective consciousness. In Conversations from the Edge, we share our conversations with you. Hello, this is Christine Madera, and welcome to Conversations from the Edge. I'm here again with Katie Kieffer, and Katie Kieffer is our Theta healer extraordinaire and a soul realignment specialist. So welcome, Katie.
Thank you for having me. These are always so much fun.
Oh my gosh, they're always a riot. And so tell us a little bit about what you do, and particularly the mix of how you bring together the soul realignment and the theta healing, because I think it's really fascinating, and it speaks to what we're going to talk about today.
Soul realignment really is about getting your soul profile and knowing who you are at soul level, how you operate, what your soul specializations are, how you're designed to manifest. Theta healing actually saved my sanity.
Mm-hmm.
It absolutely did, because I was in such a place of trauma myself and had given away so much. And I did so much work with that. I've been doing it for a little over 7 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And, having learned it, and I'm able to do it for myself. It's been massive. It's huge energy work. It's changing belief systems, removing programs. We can remove implants. We can clear karmic patterns. Though when it comes to the karmic patterns from the soul level, I will use what I learned in soul realignment to obtain the details to get, okay, what's the pattern, what's going on that we might not get to with digging in theta healing.
And it's really all about reorganizing your life from who you have learned to be and what you have learned to being the fresh expression of yourself in each moment from your place of choice.
Absolutely. And really, the most recent thing that's come up to kind of put it in a nutshell is really reclaim the truth of who you are and play life by your own soul's rules.
Yeah, I saw that on your website. I thought, oh, I love that. So, and that's absolutely true. And that is really kind of leads into sort of what we were talking about today. And that was really the shift from operating from conclusion and outcome to operating from process and creation in the moment. And that's kind of what the journey. And that's what your work is really about, because we're all wired to operate from outcome, in the sense that we're wired about what to believe, about how to believe the world works, about what's true about us and about other people. And we have this whole template in our brain and our nervous system and our body that is kind of a construction, a mental construction, an emotional construction of the world. And we live in that construction, and we operate based on the conclusions in that construction. And once you begin to dismantle that construction, and we're doing that, as a society with externally with all of our institutions and things, but we do that internally as well. When you let go of those constructions, you're really able to live the truth of who you are. And that, I think, is the beauty of your work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
And so we were going to talk a little bit about the rise of the process-oriented people.
Yes. And I'm process-oriented, and so are you. You are actually more process-oriented than I am. I got yours done, by the way.
Oh, really? Okay. I'm interested to hear about that.
Yeah, but that wasn't what our meeting today was about, but
let's actually start by talking about the difference, because I think some people might not know the difference between the process and the outcome oriented. So from your perspective, kind of explain that.
Okay, so process and outcome oriented is this is a spectrum. So at one extreme end, there's process, and on the other extreme end is outcome, but it's all part of the same spectrum. And so actually outcome is easier for people to grasp, because that's what we are taught. That's what we're taught in schools, we are taught very much that set your goal and go for it. The ends justify the means.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as long as all of the steps you're taking are in alignment with that outcome, doesn't matter, take them, push through, go get it done, and you'll get there.
And another thing I want to add to about outcome, because this is kind of where I come from with outcome as well, is that when you're in outcome, you have already decided what is real, and you organize your life and everything that you do toward that version of reality. So if your version, if you're an ideological person, this is where ideology is just nightmarish, because if you decide an ideology is true, then regardless of what's happening in your system, in your life, in your relationships, in your bank account, in your this, if that's true, you can, you change everything that's going on in your life to fit that idea or that construct or that outcome. And that's another way of being outcome oriented that's not necessarily goal oriented, because I think for people who aren't necessarily think of themselves as goal oriented can still be outcome oriented in that sense.
But yeah, and it's, we are really collectively conditioned toward the outcome. And that's been a problem for me. And I've, if you're process oriented at soul level, and outcome oriented people just do not grasp it. They, I mean, especially when we're talking about, as we were children with very unconscious parents, they didn't know. It's what they were taught, even if it has never worked for them. Because if you are process oriented and you just push through and behave as though you're outcome oriented, you are going to hate the whole process, and you're going to hate what you get. And it's really a resentment builder.
Well, I think one reason we are so outcome oriented is that when you have an outcome, this is like the human condition, right? When you have an outcome that you have decided is true, even if everything that you're going through to support that outcome is hideous, it is more tolerable because there's a certainty to it. Where when you're process oriented, and I want you to describe what process oriented is so people can recognize themselves if they're on that side of the spectrum. But if you're process oriented, then we still have to dismantle all the constructions, but we're much more comfortable with that because we tend to be more comfortable in the uncertainty of the process, because the process becomes its own, the journey of the process becomes its own rhythm and its own peacefulness and its own playground. And the uncertainty in the process unfolding, there's a certain amount of comfort in that when you think about that in terms of like relationships or global things or the external world, can seem really, really scary.
Yeah, it can. I hadn't considered that before, because when you're dealing with outcome oriented, there's like a very defined goal. Whereas when you're going through the process and you're more in the process, there is a much larger area of the unknown.
Yes, and there's a lot more cooperation that's required between people.
That's true.
If you've ever been to any kind of like a wisdom circle, or like my whole graduate degree program was really around the model of adult education and consensus building. And rather than sitting in a classroom and receiving information, it was about the exploration and expansion of information and consensus and all of this stuff. And sometimes like you're just like listening, they're going, oh my God, this is so slow, Can we just have like an outcome that we can go toward and just set me free? It can feel really arduous. And when you're a process oriented person, and we still need to talk about what that is, it is that consistent unwinding and then consistent new awarenesses coming in, sort of that dance that comes in. And it's kind of ongoing. And when it's in your energy and you're doing it for yourself, I mean, it makes goals really far away in some cases, because you go slower toward those things. it's much more satisfying. And but when you're in groups and you're doing this as a society, or even in small groups, like whether it's in a church or in a PTA, or in a book group for trying to come up with a consensus on the next book, sometimes those things can be really arduous. And so I can see why, as a society, outcome oriented is just kind of the default, because it bypasses all of this stuff, but it also creates all of these systemic problems that we end up with when we don't actually work through the process.
That's true. That's very true.
So can you explain from your perspective, what is process oriented individually, and then how does that work so people can recognize themselves?
So process oriented is all about the journey. It's about loving what you're doing. It's about how you go about getting what you want. So like one good way to mention this would be like with gardening. I would love to have a beautiful garden. I don't have a green thumb, for one. My mother can grow just about anything. She was known as a plant doctor. But I did not receive that naturally. And I've worked in gardens. I've tilled it up, and like from fresh ground, I've done a lot. And I don't like the work of it. I don't like to sweat. I don't mind a little bit. I mean, I don't want to be out there all day, every day in the summer doing that. It's not something I enjoy the doing of as much as I would love to have the result. Right. And so therefore what happens is I will end up resenting it, which is not healthy. That's not going to give the plants the energy they need to grow and be beautiful and produce fruit and vegetables. It's just not going to work. So for me to have a garden, I would need to go, okay, how do I want to do that? How do I want to set that up in a way that I will enjoy going out there, where for me, it needs to be lower maintenance? How can I set that up in a way that this is something I can have, that I can enjoy doing? And so process is about the journey, the doing of, and also it can be, who are you becoming? So at the soul level, the soul may be going, who am I becoming? Yet the human aspect is very much about, what am I doing?
And for me as well, in process, there's a particular aspect of state. Yeah. So the becoming is an important piece of it, because the beauty of it is the moving toward the becoming without the agenda of the outcome, but also the state of being as you are in the doing. So it's less like outcome oriented tends to be more focused on doing, and process oriented more in the process of being as you're doing. But I do think, so when I was talking to people who were a mix of process oriented and outcome oriented, I was realizing that actually from a personal perspective, this is not so much from a outside world perspective, but from a personal perspective, individuals who were outcome oriented, they had the outcome that they wanted, and as long as this was organic to them, and they weren't pushing themselves in the outcome, because if you're a process oriented person, like you said, pushing yourself to an outcome, that is like Dante's sixth version of hell. Yeah. But if you're really an outcome oriented person, the thing that really excites you about the outcome oftentimes is not having that thing, it is being the person who has that thing. So you're still process oriented, but you orient yourself in the process by the outcome. Process oriented people may or may not have an outcome that they're working toward, and usually it's more of an outcome of being, like I want to be this person. Right. And so I'm going to go through all of the delicious aspects of becoming that person, and I may or may not actually achieve the things that kind of person would achieve, because that wasn't really the point of it. The point of it was becoming.
Yeah. The point is the flowing through, and who are you being? Who are you becoming? That is a really great way to put it. And what's really interesting, and when I first heard this in the trainings, I went, oh, that makes so much sense to me. Process-oriented people will often sabotage themselves. And I know I have done this, and I bet you have too.
Oh, no,
we can really sabotage ourselves because we are so much in the doing and being that we're like, oh, this is so great. We don't want the outcome because then the doing and being stops. So it's like,
I know we need to become better at like changing the new process or something.
We need to have, before we get to the outcome, we need to have the groundwork for the next thing.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, whereas, because really for a process person, it's very much, once you get there, then it's like, fish in bags at the end of Nemo going, now what?
Yeah.
Because there's nothing in front of us. So we need to have something lined up or at least options to say, okay, where do I want to go next? What's the next thing I want to experience? Not so much the next thing I want to create. So a really good way of putting this is, once the creations are complete and it's done, the outcome person is going to say, look at what I made. And the process person is going to go, look at what I did.
Or who I am.
Exactly. And so, and to speak of intangible ways, like especially physical, tangible things that have been made, an outcome, a person is more likely to say, look at what I made. A process person is going to be more likely to say, look at what I did, with the whole knowing of who they needed to be in that process. And outcome oriented, it's not, and there is a whole middle ground. You can land smack dab in the middle of the spectrum, which means you really need the balance of both. And so, understanding how you're wired to operate at soul level. Just because you're wired to operate a particular way at soul level does not mean that that's how you actually show up. And this is a really good spectrum to highlight that, because we are taught to pick your goal, go for it, do what it takes to get there. And if you're outcome oriented, that's very supportive. But if you're process oriented, it's very disorienting, actually.
Well, and from a human design perspective, and not to interject this, I don't want to go deep into human design, but from a human design perspective, if people have heard of that, only about 7 or 8% of people are wired to do the whole outcome goal-oriented thing successfully. It is not a high percentage, but they do it so well and it looks so easy that we all get sucked into thinking that's how it's done. But it's also easy to see how it's done, because it's done, very methodically in the external world, where most people, and the inner work is done along the way, but that's not seen.
Right.
Whereas, the process people, you often don't see the outcome until you get there.
Right.
Because the process is, so we all look like we're little tortoises, but what they say about the tortoise and the hare. So what actually, where we got to this topic was that you had this insight that the time for outcome oriented people, or for not outcome oriented people, because we're always going to need them, but people, an outcome oriented society where all of our systems and our focus is on, starting from the outcome and doing things to support the outcome, being outcome oriented in how we design ourselves as a system and as a society, is fading. And the rise of the process oriented people. And one of the things we talked about before we hopped on is that for outcome-oriented people, or for process-oriented people, we are present moment people. We're really, if you're operating from outcome, you've got a preconceived notion about how things are supposed to be. And if you look at our systems, when we do that, they don't often function the way that we think they're supposed to be, because mostly it's human beings and we do weird things, and so things don't line up along how we think they're supposed to be. But process oriented people are kind of open systems that, as people come in, or as new things happen, we're able to bring that into the process. and work from the present moment. And that skill set, that ability is really what's going to be moving us forward in the future. So you had brought that up. So let's talk about that a little bit. Do you have any more insight on that?
You had a really good response to that, was that it's more feminine. And we hear a lot about, the rise of the divine feminine. And so there is a balance that's happening. And I hadn't considered that the feminine, that there's also just an element of masculine feminine energy involved with this until you said that. And it's like, I really think there's room for that. I'm not really sure how they fit together, but, and I don't want to focus too much on that, but there's very much, I think we are coming back into balance, and because we need all of it, because it's the idea of, like, when we look at the way the world is and what some of these like movements are moving toward, I can really get behind the ideals, but I can't get behind how they're doing it.
Right.
I mean, this whole idea of, we want people to have health care and be sheltered, and people to have, the basic human needs met.
Right.
I absolutely get behind that completely, 100%. I cannot get behind doing that in any way, shape, or form that infringes on free will. And so it's the ideals. I'm like, I agree completely, but I think we really need to assess how we're getting there. So it's like, we have this generalized outcome. How are we going to get there in a way that is truly honoring of so many individuals and their free will? And I do take a little bit of a selective look at this, because and two, with the very quick rise in awareness around trauma is actually helping, because a lot of people are just responding from places of trauma, and it's that knee-jerk reaction, and there's just so many moving parts. So as a collective, I do think that it's like we're in the middle of a shakedown between, these are the outcomes we want. Now, how are we going to get there? And we've got to pay attention to the process, because if we don't pay attention to the process, we're not going to be able to get to that outcome, or it will only shift from this group of people to that group of people, which still leaves us in the same energy.
And that's where we tend, like with the Me Too movement and different, and the woke movement and things, it's often sort of a shifting from, from one victim to another victim. And then we talk about things in terms also of, like, who's going to pay for it. So
that's the other thing.
So and that is actually a whole different conversation, but it speaks to this one in the sense that, right now, oftentimes the highest value is the dollar value. So the highest value is like, how much is this going to cost and who's going to pay for it, versus how do we house everybody who chooses to be housed in a way where money serves that purpose, versus a way that, like, that purpose serves money.
Right.
And so it's sort of the flipping of the values, and you're expanding that a little bit, or a lot, to how do we actually achieve housing for those who choose to have it, or healthcare, or whatever. And I've got my own issues with the whole healthcare thing, but how do we allow everybody access to those things, and house everybody that chooses to house it, again, without infringing upon their free will, but also in a way that serves the benefit of all. Because allowing a person who chooses to be homeless to do that in any way that they choose can infringe upon other people's free will and rights. So there's there's this larger conversation, and I think it does require and the idea around trauma is really good, because oftentimes when we're in trauma, and we've all been exposed to trauma, it just just living in a human body. I mean, birth is trauma, right? So everything
can be.
It can't be. Well, and the whole idea, well, anyway, I'm not going to go into that. But so anything, we all have traumas, and it resets our brain to react in certain ways. And so when we can recognize that in ourselves and one another and begin to create processes of being with one another where we cannot enshrine the trauma, and because the whole thing about the self-righteous victim, that if I'm a victim, nobody can say anything bad about me because I'm a victim. And so I've become a professional victim, and everything I say is okay because I'm a victim. So without enshrining victimhood, but recognizing that we all have shared experiences of trauma, even if our traumas are different, so that we can come from a place of mutual understanding. And the process of coming toward mutually beneficial outcomes versus a top-down outcome, or an outcome that just sweeps all the homeless people off the streets, and then it looks better, but then where are they? And that just kind of makes homelessness illegal versus actually solving the systems that hold that in place.
As a collective society, we've been very good at, and we're taught this too, we're taught just through example to manage the symptoms rather than looking for the root cause. And really, if we can get down to the root cause, which is when we start looking at these much larger issues that we're dealing with as a collective, finding those root issues, I don't think we're going to find just one. And I think we're going to find that if each individual gets to their personal root issues, as we have that, it's like the 100 monkey effect that happens. As we get that, because what creates the collective? Individuals create the collective. And so when we have individuals who are not doing their own inner work, who are not actively looking for their own root causes and looking for that personal change, but they're trying to go change the collective, there's just a little bit of a gap there. Well, and it depends on the situation, because it's like I was going to say there's a gap, and I'm like, well, no, not always, because I'm very good at, like, these dots will pop up in the mid sentence for me, and it's like, well, that's not 100% true, but there's absolutely truth there. And so I end up kind of working through this as I'm speaking, and so I can feel a little disjointed sometimes, but it's very much that we're not going to have massive change in the collective unless and until we have individual change as well. And one will inform the other. And if we have mass collective change, like in the way of like new laws being made, if there's a new law that's made that just completely eradicates this, that, or the other, all they're doing is making something wrong. They're not getting to a root cause to say, how do we actually make this change? They're trying to eliminate a symptom rather than heal a cause. And long term, that's not going to work.
No. And so that's why I like the process oriented, I think, it's a longer term fix. But if you look at our long term problems, like if we'd have chosen the long term fix, we might have some solutions versus just kind of continuing to perpetuate the problems in different ways. This actually harkens back to our last conversation around authority. Because when we're outcome oriented in policies and outcome oriented in how we create solutions, it's really about, and this is why I think none of them seem to work, is that we are asking people to give their authority over to this solution. And for some people, that solution may benefit them. They might be totally online about giving their authority over to that because that makes their life easier. But for a lot of people, and usually they're the ones who are, sort of what we call the victims in this, when they're being asked to give their authority over to that, it's even further victimizing people. It's sort of a deepening of the trauma. Because to me, one of the deep traumas that we have is where we have been either forced or compelled or in some other way taught to give away our authority, and the whole idea that we have self-determination, not in everything that we do, because we know we live in a world where there's there's a lot of things going on. And so we don't have absolute control over everything that happens to us, but we do have a lot more self-volition and ability to navigate the world in a way from our own authority than we are taught that we have. We're to be taught that we need to react and respond versus create and act.
Well, that's interesting because you and I are both instigative on that spectrum.
Explain that.
So there's instigative and reactive. Mm-hmm. So there's a spectrum. One extreme is instigative and the other extreme is reactive. And we are really very often, especially those of us who have had like low-grade chronic trauma from childhood on until we've started doing our own healing work, we end up being in that reactive space. So we are always reacting to what's happening outside of us. Mm-hmm. And some people are wired to do that and it works for them. But that's the whole thing, is that if it's getting them results, if they can go, oh, I don't like that thing there, or it could be that they see something and go, oh, I want that, or I want something like that. That's a reaction. Whereas instigative actually kind of works the opposite way. So for me, like one of the visuals that I got about instigative is we instigate things to see how the outside world reacts.
Oh yeah.
So it's like the inverse. It's very much about, oh, let's do this and see what happens, rather than in constant reactive mode. Now, I have behaved in reactive mode most of my life. When I realized that at soul level, I'm wired to be instigative, and I started like having these like micro memories pop up of where would be an appropriate place to do it. I mean, it's a very appropriate thing to go and say, ooh, this is a puddle. What's it going to do if I touch the top of it, or if I drop something into it? It's exploration. It's curiosity. And nothing's getting hurt.
Yeah. And well, and I think that speaks also then to, we're in this movement towards self-empowerment. We're in this movement towards self-authority, but that's going to look different for people like you and I who are curiosity-based and instigative-based, and people who are natural responders and reactors. Mm-hmm. And so, it's good when you're around too many people who are like you, which is really a wider problem for us in general, is that we tend to, just as a human condition, think that everybody is like us. And the more we're around people who are like us, the more we think that's like the way that everybody operates, or the way that we're all supposed to be. So it is good to remember that, we come in a wide variety of flavors. And the whole process of how do we allow everybody to be true to their true nature, to who they truly are, and support them in their own empowerment and authority as we move forward, and do that in a way that helps people, but also helps move them into a greater level of responsibility, of self-responsibility, and of self-authority, and of self-determination. And I think that's big work. There's like 7 billion of us on the planet at this moment. And to do that, individually, I think is where we need to start with that, is to step into that personally, but then also to hold that wider intention, and knowing that everybody comes to this in their own way. Right. And it's easy to get impatient when people are doing it differently than you. And if you're an outcome-oriented person, you probably spend a lot of your time being impatient with process-oriented people.
Absolutely.
And vice versa. So I think, stepping back and really recognizing within yourself, because I always think that the path to compassion is self-recognition. So to recognize in yourself, like where you are, just to come back to our original train of thought, where you are operating in outcome oriented that may not be authentic to you, and where it may really be authentic to you. And where you are or are not operating in process orientation that may be authentic to you, or are you being forced to do that in a way that's not. But finding where you are with that to help you better have compassion for the process of other people. And in whatever that is, because if their process is being outcome oriented, that's still a process, because between here and there is a process.
Right. It's just a different way of operating.
Yeah. It just looks different.
Yeah.
So Ms. Energy Wizard Katie, do you have anything that you can offer us to help bring in the energy of this, or coalesce the energy of this for us as a way to kind of wind this down?
Let me see. Let me just check in a minute here and see. So really what I'm feeling again is very much that let's bring in Creator's highest truth, perspective, and understanding, and bring in a blessing rather than doing a major meditation.
Okay.
So bringing in a blessing for this conversation with Creator's highest truth, perspective, understanding, and wisdom, and with Creator's compassion and kindness, that as we each grow and learn and have awarenesses awaken within us as to how we operate and how someone else may operate, that is really filled with kindness and compassion for ourselves and for one another, and that there's space for all of us. There's space for all of us to operate as we are wired at soul level, and that we may just need to be able to come back into that. Mm-hmm. And also allowing others to operate how they are designed to operate, that there's plenty of space for all of us, and we can all do so in harmony. And that as we move more towards this, that the harmony of the collective will increase, that it will reach the collective as we each walk our own journeys and our own paths.
Perfect.
So yeah, I'm watching Creator bring that in. I'm feeling it land. How about you?
I'm feeling it land. And that space, there's a law. I was just seeing if I could find it really fast, because we do a lot of universal law things, but that talks about, the collective, as you just called it, as the gestalt of where we are all going collectively as one. I think it's probably the law of one. And so this is actually perfect for that, because to remember that we are all one, and we are moving forward individually, but also as one, as a collective, as a gestalt. And so creating that space for one another is actually creating space for ourselves.
That's beautiful. Yes.
So thank you so very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. These are always so fun.
I know. This is what our personal conversations are like, only they go on for like 3 hours. So we decide to break them up for you. All right. So you can always find Katie's contact information and all of our conversations on conversationsfromtheedge.net. But Katie, why don't you tell us how people can reach out to you specifically and directly?
For direct, you can go to awakentheinnerlight.com, and there's a little pop-up that's, leave a message, book a session. So you can email me through there, or you can find me on Facebook. I have a Facebook page. It's Awaken the Inner Light. And those would be the two ways to get a hold of me.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much for the conversation today. It's wonderful talking with you, and I'm looking forward to talking again soon.
As always, it's a pleasure, and I am too. Thank you.
This is your host, Christine Madera. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation from the edge of consciousness. You can find all our conversations at conversationsfromtheedge.net. You'll also find links to schedule a private conversation with me or any of my friends, as well as tools to help you expand your own consciousness and explore what's possible for you outside the boundaries of your current perceptions. Feel free to use this podcast to start your own conversation by sharing it with friends, on social media, in your blog, or even in your own podcast. And as always, live the adventure of pushing your own edge. It's the most amazing adventure there is.